I am 36 years old, and I never meant to fall for the man my sister loved. My name is Jade Leigh, and if you'd have asked me 5 years ago who I was, I would have said the older sister, the overlooked one, the one who makes tea, not noise. But that changed. It changed on a snow-heavy Christmas Eve in Cherry Lake, Pennsylvania, 1951. Back then, I was just a school librarian with a quiet life and a broken engagement I never talked about. My younger sister, Caroline, was the beauty of the town, 26, bright blonde, full of charm and flirt. She'd always had a way of stepping into a room and stealing all the attention, and the men. And then came Lucas Callahan. He was 29, and the moment Caroline brought him home from the town fair, everyone knew he was different. He wasn't from money. His boots were worn. His knuckles showed the wear of labor. But his eyes? They held something steady, something searching. Mama said, "He's not your type, Caroline." Caroline said, "I'm bored with my type." I didn't say anything. Not that winter. Not for the next 2 years. I stayed in the shadows serving pie, folding napkins, nodding at Lucas's kind hellos while he and Caroline strolled into every church service and square dance like royalty. They seemed perfect. Until you looked closer. It was in the autumn of 1953 when things shifted. Lucas lost his job at the textile mill after it closed down, and with no union and no backup, he fell hard. Caroline, of course, hated poverty. She hated anything without shine. She began visiting her old friend Terrence Whitmore a little too often, the lawyer with a Cadillac and cologne that smelled like lies. Lucas tried to hold on. He worked odd jobs, helped mend barns, swept floors at the school where I worked. We'd exchange brief nods. And then one day, I found him in the library's back hallway, quietly fixing a broken radiator, drenched in sweat. "I'm not asking for pity," he said. I hadn't offered any, but that moment began it. By Thanksgiving, Caroline was already growing cold. She mocked him for the clothes he wore, for turning down a loan from Whitmore, for not being a real provider. I saw the way he winced, and I started leaving coffee out on the school steps. No notes, no names. He knew it was me. We never crossed lines, not then. We just talked sometimes. About books, about old farm life, about dreams that didn't include silver spoons and showy dances. He confessed he missed home, a little ranch in Laurel Creek that his grandfather lost during the war. I confessed I missed being seen, and yet, we didn't say more. Until Christmas Eve. The Leigh family Christmas gala was always the talk of Cherry Lake. The snow had fallen hard that year, and the white lights wrapped every tree from Main Street to Maple Bridge. Caroline had dressed in a red velvet gown, with gold heels she could barely walk in. Lucas had no job, no new coat, and no confidence. He stood outside the church hall when Caroline passed him without a word, laughing on the arm of Terrence Whitmore. I saw Lucas freeze, holding a gift in his hand wrapped in old newspaper with twine. He turned to leave, and that's when I stepped outside and said, "You'll freeze out here." He smiled like he didn't know what else to do. I pulled him into the warmth of the hallway. Caroline saw. She turned, her lips curling in disbelief. "You invited him?" "I invited everyone," I said. She looked between us, and in that moment, she knew. She didn't speak to me again that night, and by midnight, she was gone, left with Whitmore in his car, leaving behind a single letter on Mama's dining table. "Lucas, you're free. I won't marry a man who begs. I deserve more." See, Lucas read it twice. Then he looked at me, and I'll never forget the ache in his eyes. Not longing, just the weight of a man who had tried everything and lost it all. We didn't kiss. We didn't hold hands. We just stood in silence while the snow kept falling and something began to shift. Something called truth. The morning after Christmas was quiet to quiet. The snowfall had thickened overnight, blanketing Cherry Lake in stillness as if the town itself held its breath, waiting to see what would happen now that Caroline Leigh had vanished into the night with a man in a pinstriped coat. Mama didn't ask questions. She just cleared the untouched pie from the dining room table and folded Caroline's letter into a drawer like it was a bill she couldn't bear to open. Lucas sat at the corner of the porch, his hands wrapped around a chipped mug of weak coffee. He hadn't said a word since the night before. I hadn't pushed him to speak either. Sometimes grief, even when deserved, takes its time coming to the surface. "She's not coming back, is she?" he asked softly, not looking at me. I shook my head. No. In the days that followed, the town buzzed. Some said Caroline had left for Philadelphia. Others claimed she'd gone to Charleston with Whitmore and was living in a manor with chandeliers and wine that cost more than our porch steps, but no one came asking about Lucas. He faded into the background like a rejected painting, too good for the trash but never meant for the gallery. He took odd jobs again, fixed roofs, chopped wood. I saw him more often now, not because I chased him but because I didn't need to. He kept showing up at the library. Sometimes he'd sit in the back near the old fireplace and just read. Other times, he'd ask me questions about books he'd never read as a boy. Moby Dick, The Great Gatsby. His favorite became Of Mice and Men. I feel like Lenny, he said one day. Too big, too hopeful, too easy to crush. I didn't tell him that I felt like George Quiet, holding back the bullet. By late January, rumors came that Caroline was engaged again to Whitmore. No church wedding, no guests, just a legal binding and a diamond ring the size of a silver dollar. Mama cried the day the news reached us. Not because Caroline had left, but because she hadn't even bothered to write. That week, Lucas came to me with a letter of his own. I'm leaving, he said. I have a cousin down in Georgia who needs help building a stable. I can't stay here. I nodded, trying not to show how deeply that cut. I wanted to thank you, he added, for being kind. I opened my mouth to reply, but the words tangled somewhere between my heart and throat. Before I could find them, he turned to go. Lucas, I finally called out. Wait. He paused. I don't regret anything. His shoulders rose, then fell. He gave me the smallest smile, one that looked stitched together with old memories, and disappeared into the snow. Months passed. Spring arrived. The town moved on. But I did, in single quotes, T.T. I wrote letters I never sent, folded memories into the pages of books he'd once touched. And every Christmas, I left a gift wrapped in old newspaper on the library doorstep just in case. Then came the summer of 1955, and everything changed. I was shelving books when a man in a dark coat entered the library. His boots clicked like certainty. He wore a hat pulled low and a scar beneath his left ear. Jade Leigh? He asked. Yes. He handed me an envelope sealed in gold wax. You've been named in a trust. I blinked. A what? A trust. By autumn, the town of Cherry Lake had begun whispering my name again, but not in the way they used to. Before, I was Jade Leigh, the older sister, the spinster librarian, the background blur behind Caroline's spotlight. But now I was Miss Leigh, the Holloway heiress, the woman who owned more square footage than the town council combined. I didn't ask for the money. I certainly didn't chase it, but I wasn't going to apologize for receiving it either. The day after the inheritance was finalized, I walked into the boardroom of Ashford Manufacturing, the largest employer in the county and the same company that had once laughed off Lucas Callahan's job application. I wore a gray wool coat and leather gloves that had belonged to Eleanor herself. 3 men in suits stood to greet me. They hadn't expected me to show up in person. I want to exercise my voting rights, I said calmly. All 60% of them. The air shifted like a thunderclap had rolled through the oak-paneled room. Of course, Miss Leigh, said Mr. Peterman, the chairman. How would you like to proceed? I opened the binder in my arms and laid out my first list of changes. First, I said, terminate Terrence Whitmore. Effective immediately. Mr. Peterman blinked. He's your brother-in-law, isn't he? He's nothing to me, I replied. And he committed accounting fraud under your nose last fiscal year. Check the June ledger. They did. He was gone by sundown. The second item was even simpler. I didn't fire Caroline, not yet. I just had her moved to the lowest paying position in the company. Stockroom clerk. No assistants. No chauffeurs. Just wooden boxes and dust. I left no note, no explanation. Let her climb, I thought. Let her see how the rest of us lived when she laughed from balconies. In the weeks that followed, I kept my head down. I made small changes across the town, restored the old music hall, reopened the public kitchen, and paid off the debt of the widow who used to teach me piano. But people noticed. Whispers turned into theories. Had Jade Leigh always been this powerful? Was she behind Whitmore's downfall? What would she do next? Then came the letter from Lucas. It arrived on a Thursday, written in familiar penmanship, slightly smudged from travel. I heard what you've done, and who you've become. I'm working in Atlanta now, finally bought a piece of land. But I never forgot you. I still remember the coffee, and the silence. Thank you for being the only truth in a time full of lies. I read it twice, folded it, placed it inside my coat pocket, and then I booked a train to Georgia. We met in a small diner just outside Cartersville. He looked older, lines around the eyes, rougher hands, but the steadiness in his voice was still there. I can't believe it, he said, sipping black coffee. You own Ashford? I nodded. And you fired Whitmore? He deserved worse, I said. Lucas leaned back and studied me with something between admiration and concern. Are you happy? I didn't answer right away. I'm not bitter, I said finally. But happiness? I think it's waiting for me to forgive the past. I'm not ready yet, he nodded slowly. I wanted to give you this, I said, sliding a leather folder across the table. He opened it and froze. These are land deeds, he said. This is Laurel Creek. I nodded again. I bought back your grandfather's ranch. His eyes welled, but he blinked it away. Jade, I can't accept this. It's already in your name. He exhaled hard, like he'd just stepped out of a dream. Then quietly, I never thought anyone would believe in me like this. I looked down at my hands. I believed in you when you were holding broken plumbing and still offering to fix more. We didn't embrace. Not yet. But we walked out of the diner together into the Georgia dusk, and for the first time in 2 years, I felt lighter, still unfinished, but lighter. Back in Cherry Lake, word spread that the new owner of Ashford had been spotted with a tall, dark-haired stranger. Caroline stormed into the office one morning, heels clicking with fury. You're ruining everything, she hissed at me. You've humiliated me, fired my fiancé, took away my job. Why? I stared at her, the sister who had once left a man like Lucas for a man like Terrence. Because you taught me, I said, that sometimes people don't change unless you show them who they've become. Her face flushed red, but she didn't speak. By Christmas, the town square had a new tradition, a free gala, open to everyone. No tickets, no status, just music, warmth, and welcome. And at the center of it, a quiet woman in a gray coat served cider to anyone who asked, her eyes still watchful, still steady, because revenge doesn't always come wrapped in rage. Sometimes, it comes dressed in grace. The snow returned to Cherry Lake just 2 days before Christmas. It fell softly that morning as I stepped out of Ashford's front office, watching as the townsfolk walked past my building, the same building that once turned away the only good man my sister ever knew. Now, it welcomed workers with new wages, fair hours, and the respect they had long been denied. I had changed the rules, but I hadn't changed the town's memory. People still looked at me like they weren't sure whether to curtsy or cross themselves. In their eyes, I was either a saint or a warning, and I didn't mind either. Not until Caroline returned with fire in her heels and smoke in her voice. She hadn't come to beg. Caroline never begged. She came with lawyers. Miss Leigh, said the man in the gray coat as he handed me a formal letter. Your sister is contesting the trust. She's claiming undue influence over Eleanor Holloway in her final months. I read the notice quietly. She claims you manipulated the will, that you weren't entitled to the inheritance. I looked up slowly. She wants what I earned by being decent when she was cruel. She says it belongs to her family legacy. I gave a thin smile. Funny, she didn't care about legacy when she left her own family behind. The courtroom was small, and the judge even smaller, a tired man with half-moon glasses and an allergy to theatrics. The townsfolk filled the benches like it was a Christmas Eve pageant. Caroline wore a deep emerald dress and crocodile tears. I wore a navy coat, and my silence. Her lawyer painted me as a manipulator, a spinster who preyed on an old widow's loneliness. He said I tricked Eleanor into signing away her estate, said I kept my true intentions hidden behind books and tea trays. I didn't flinch. Christmas morning in Cherry Lake had always smelled like cedar and cinnamon, but this year, it smelled like something different. New beginnings. I stood by the window of the Holloway estate, wrapped in a wool shawl that once belonged to Eleanor, watching as the first rays of winter sun touched the stone lions guarding the front gates. For years, this house had been just a myth to me. Now, it was mine. Every inch, every secret hallway, every creaking stairboard, and yet, it still felt like it belonged to someone else, someone grander, someone more certain of herself. Lucas had spent the night on the ranch with the horses. He sent word that he'd be in town before noon, with a surprise. I didn't know if I was ready for more surprises. Around 10 o'clock, I walked through the estate's grand hall where portraits of men I'd never met stared down at me, as if wondering how someone like me had landed in their line of legacy. I had asked myself the same question 100 times since the trust settled, But the truth was, I didn't land here. I walked here, through fire, through snow, through betrayal. The doorbell rang at exactly 11. I opened it to find Lucas, not in his work boots and denim but in a clean gray coat and navy scarf. He looked like a man who had found peace and still remembered what it cost. Behind him stood a woman, her hands in gloves, her posture straight as a fence post. She had kind eyes and a scar along her left cheek. "Jade, this is Sarah Callahan," he said. "My sister-in-law." I blinked. "I didn't know you had a sister-in-law." "We weren't close," he said. "But she's the one who bought back half the land near the ranch. Turns out, her late husband left it to her. When she heard what I was trying to rebuild, she reached out." Sarah stepped forward. "And I've got a proposal, Miss Leigh." She handed me a small folder. Inside were blueprints, a plan to expand the ranch into a community co-op. Horses, farming, workshops, and housing for struggling families. "You'd keep your name on it, of course," Sarah said. "But I'd run the operations. And Lucas, well, he's the heart of it." I stared at the sketches, my heart caught between awe and fear. "You're asking me to leave the city," I whispered. "To start over in dirt and hay and good intentions?" "I'm not asking," Lucas said gently. "I'm inviting." That night, I walked the halls of Holloway Manor alone. Each room whispered with ghosts. Eleanor's tea tray in the drawing room, my father's worn shoes tucked behind a closet door, and on the study desk, still dusted with candle wax, sat the last letter I'd written to myself weeks ago. "When you finally stop looking for justice, will you know how to look for joy?" The answer scared me. The next morning, I did something bold. I walked into Ashford Manufacturing one last time, gathered the board, and handed in my resignation as active chair. "I'll retain majority ownership," I told them. "But I'm stepping away from day-to-day operations. Hire someone honest. Someone who remembers what it's like to earn $1 before you spend it." There were shocked faces, murmurs, questions, but I didn't stay to answer them. 3 days later, Lucas and I stood on the porch of the old Callahan ranch. The snow was melting, and the soil beneath was rich and ready. We broke ground together with nothing but a borrowed shovel and a thermos of black coffee between us. "We should name the first foal Eleanor," I joked. Lucas laughed. "Only if it's stubborn." We paused, then he added, "So, Eleanor it is." Back in town, Caroline had all but vanished. Word had it she was living in a small apartment above a hardware store in Brighton, pretending the past never happened. I didn't follow her story anymore. Some ghosts deserve to drift, but I did leave her one thing before I left the estate: a key to the library we both grew up visiting. The only place where we were ever equals. I don't know if she ever used it, but it was there. That Christmas, the town threw a surprise festival in the square. It wasn't grand, just lanterns, pies, and laughter. Someone even carved a wooden statue of a woman in a book-lined coat holding a lantern. It didn't look like me exactly, but it didn't have to. It looked like every woman who ever waited quietly and struck when no one saw it coming. Because sometimes revenge doesn't scream. It doesn't burn down buildings or ruin names. Sometimes, revenge looks like peace, like love that didn't need permission, like a ranch rebuilt and a home rediscovered. It was the kind of January morning where the sky looked like paper, dull and blank, waiting for ink. The snow had begun to melt in soft patches across the hills behind the ranch, revealing tufts of brown grass and black soil. I was in the barn, feeding Eleanor the foal who'd already kicked her way into legend. The wind on the morning of the co-op's grand opening was crisp, but not cruel. The kind that woke you gently, whispering something new is beginning. Lucas stood near the entrance of the big red barn, tying down white streamers that fluttered like doves in the breeze. Sarah was already inside arranging tables and cinnamon loaves. The smell of coffee, pine, and freshly polished wood drifted through the wide open space. For the first time, the ranch didn't feel like a place for healing, it felt like a place for living. And tonight, it would be filled with music, stories, laughter, and people who had once been pushed to the margins, now invited to the center. I adjusted the collar of my navy blue coat and glanced at the crowd gathering beyond the pasture gate. Horses grazed in the distance, calm and unbothered. It had taken a full year, 12 exacting months of sweat, paperwork, doubting, rebuilding. But we'd done it. We were about to open the doors to something that wasn't just mine. It was ours. By 6 o'clock, the lanterns were lit. Children with mittens cupped warm cider. Former Ashford workers sat beside their wives, smiling. Someone started tuning a fiddle near the hayloft, and tucked in every corner of the barn were things I'd once thought I had lost: trust, laughter, a future. Then I saw her, Caroline. She stood at the edge of the crowd, wearing a dark gray coat and a maroon scarf. Her hair was pinned up, simpler than I remembered. Her hands were clasped tightly in front of her, like she was praying not to be noticed and hoping she might be. Our eyes met, and time folded in on itself. I took a slow breath and walked over. "Didn't expect you," I said. "I almost didn't come," she replied. "You brought coffee." She held up a thermos with a tired smile. "Cinnamon brew, my best seller." For a moment, we stood in silence. It wasn't warm, but it wasn't bitter either. "I heard what you did here," she said, glancing at the barn. "Lucas told me." "He talks to you now?" I asked, arching a brow. She gave a faint chuckle. "No, but he stopped in for bread last week. Left behind a flyer." I folded my arms. "You look, well, I feel tired," she admitted, "but I'm trying." "That has to count for something." I studied her for a long moment. "It does." Then I pointed toward the barn doors. "Come in. Everyone's welcome." She hesitated, as if unsure whether the invitation was real. "It's not a trick," I added. "We left those behind in the city." She nodded and stepped through the gate. Inside, Sarah handed her a cup. Lucas nodded politely but didn't say much. And Caroline didn't ask for more. She stood quietly in the back, watching as the first song began, a slow, soulful ballad played by a young girl with patched boots and a borrowed violin. The room swayed gently to the melody. I leaned against the side rail, next to Lucas, our shoulders touching just enough. "You okay?" he asked. "I think so," I said. He smiled. "You look like someone who just survived a storm and found her favorite boots still dry." I laughed. "That's strangely accurate." Later that night, as the crowd began to drift out and the firelight burned low, Caroline approached me once more. She reached into her coat pocket and handed me a folded paper. "What's this?" I asked. "My share of Mom's old trust. I found out about it last month," she said softly. "Turns out, she left a clause, one that gave each of us a separate portion if we reached 35. I opened the paper and saw the number, 15000. She continued. "I don't want it. Not all of it. I want to use it to build a reading room in the barn. For kids, for women, for people like us." I looked at her, stunned. "You sure?" "I want to do one good thing," she said, "for the right reasons." And that's when I saw it, not the girl who once sneered at me across tea tables or made me feel like wallpaper. I saw a woman trying to start again, brick by brick. I took the paper, folded it gently, and said, "Let's name it the Lantern Room, after the statue." Caroline smiled, "A real one this time." "Perfect," she whispered. That night, I sat by the fireplace with Lucas, sipping cider while snow tapped softly against the windows. "You did it," he said. "We did it," I replied. Then I rested my head on his shoulder and said nothing at all, because not every victory needs a speech. Some just need quiet and peace and a room full of people who finally see you. By mid-February, the wind softened. The snow melted from the edges of the roof and the earth began to smell like damp wood and promise. The barn was no longer just a barn. It had become a refuge, a rhythm, and now with Caroline's contribution it would hold something more, a space carved out for voices that had once been shushed or overlooked. The lantern room was almost finished. Lucas built the shelves himself, hand-sanded, walnut, smooth as river stones. Sarah picked out the rugs and curtains, and I, for the first the morning sun spilled like amber across the old ledger desk in the lantern room. I stared at the certificate again, my name printed beside the bold numbers, 20% ownership. I had stared at it so long that the ink no longer felt like just words. It felt like weight, power, history. And now, a choice. Caroline found me there just after breakfast, holding 2 mugs of hot lemon tea, her hair damp from the early spring rain. "You haven't slept," she said. "No," I replied. "Didn't feel right." She set the mugs down and sat across from me, her eyes sweeping over the parchment between us. "What will you do?" "I don't know," I answered truthfully. "Burn it, frame it, use it." Caroline was quiet for a while. Then she said, "There's a board meeting this Friday in Charleston. Word is, they're finalizing dissolution papers. But if you show up with that," I looked up, "you could stop them, or take control." I sat back, feeling the pressure of years on my chest. I'd spent most of my 20s running from boardrooms. Now one was calling me back with stakes higher than ever. Lucas and I drove to Charleston the next morning. The city looked the same. Grand brick facades, iron balconies, and storefronts with names that had stood longer than most memories. But I felt different. I wasn't the intern anymore. I wasn't the girl they patronized or passed over. I was a woman carrying fire wrapped in paperwork. The Ashford boardroom still smelled like old varnish and condescension. 7 men in dark suits and 1 woman with a stern gaze sat around the oval table. Their eyes widened as I stepped in. "Miss Leigh," the chairman began, surprised. "This meeting is closed." "Not anymore," I interrupted. I slid the certificate across the polished mahogany. "This document is valid. Signed and dated. You've withheld ownership from me for over 3 years." There was silence, then whispers, then rustling papers. "I demand to be added to the ledger, and I call for a vote." The chairman cleared his throat. "A vote for what exactly?" I didn't hesitate. "To dissolve Ashford and use the assets to create a public trust for women displaced by company closures, a scholarship fund, and a rural business grant." "You want to burn it all down?" One man scoffed. "No," I replied. "I want to rebuild it for the people you left behind." The vote passed barely, 4-3, with 1 abstaining. By Friday afternoon, Ashford Manufacturing was no longer an empire. It was the seed of something better, and I walked out with nothing in my hands but everything I had ever been denied. That evening, I returned to the ranch. Lucas was waiting on the porch with 2 cider glasses and a quiet smile. "How did it go?" he asked. "They tried to ignore me," I said. He grinned. "And I made sure I was the last voice in the room." The next morning, I stood in the lantern room and held the framed certificate for the last time. I didn't keep it. Instead, I placed it in a wooden time box beside the first ever co-op ledger, Sarah's recipe book, and a letter Caroline wrote to herself. Then I locked the box and buried it beneath the rose bush near the barn. Some legacies aren't meant to be flaunted. Some are meant to anchor quietly, powerfully beneath the roots of something living. On the first day of spring, the town of Cherry Lake held its first women's trade fair, funded by the new trust. Dozens of women came from nearby towns, selling crafts, food, and books. Some wore second-hand coats, others designer scarves, but every one of them had fire in their eyes. Caroline passed out pamphlets with Sarah. Miriam read her latest poem on stage. Lucas played guitar in the shade. And I, for once, stood without anything to prove, because I had already proven it. To them, to myself, to the world that once said just a girl, and I still was, just a girl. But now, one who owned the room, one who changed the rules, one who made sure no girl ever had to beg for her seat at the table again. Spring had fully arrived in Cherry Lake. The air smelled of lilac and pinewood, and the evenings stretched longer, as if even time itself had grown curious about what came next.